A 76-year-old retired soldier walks into the Pemberton Regional Archery Championship carrying a recurve bow that looks like it came out of a museum. No carbon fibre, no stabilizers, no sight pins, no clicker. Just a plain wooden riser, worn smooth at the grip, with a shelf carved by hand and a rest made from a small square of rabbit fur stitched on with dental floss. The string was real linen, not Dyneema, not fast flight linen, the kind nobody had used competitively since the 1980s. The limbs were pale ash, the wood dry and pale in a few places where the finish had worn through, and along the lower limb, if you looked closely, you could make out the faint impression of a name burned into the wood in small letters. The kind of thing a man does when he wants to remember where something came from. He carried it in a canvas sleeve, not a hard case. The sleeve was olive drab, stenciled with a serial number that meant nothing to anyone in that gymnasium anymore. The competitors around him were setting up compound bows that cost more than a decent used car. Matthews, Hoyt, PSE, equipment with let-off percentages and draw stops and arrow rests that held the shaft in place with a magnetic field. Several of them had matching quivers, matching tabs, matching spotting scopes on tripods. One young man was adjusting his third axis level with a hex key, very carefully, the way you level a piece of scientific equipment. Another was consulting a rangefinder app on his phone that cross-referenced wind speed, humidity, and ambient light. The range inside the Pemberton Recreation Complex was well lit and dead calm, which meant most of that technology was academic, but they used it anyway because that was simply the way things were done now. Nobody said anything to the old man at first. They just looked. He found a spot at the far end of the preparation area and set the canvas sleeve on a folding chair and pulled the bow out with both hands. Slowly, the way you handle something that has known a great deal of weather. He strung it without a bowstringer, which was the first thing that made a few people pause. Using a step-through method, 1 foot through the lower limb, the upper tip seated against his shoulder, he bent the bow with a smooth, practiced motion and slipped the loop over the tip. Nobody who hadn't done that 1,000 times makes it look that easy. The bow settled into its natural arc, and he ran one thumb along the string, listening the way a musician tunes by ear. The young man with the hex key stopped what he was doing and watched. Then someone laughed. Not cruelly, at first, more the reflexive laughter of genuine surprise. A woman in her late 20s who was ranked 3rd in British Columbia said, loud enough to carry 2 benches over, that she hadn't seen a setup like that outside a historical society display. Her shooting partner, a tall man who coached at Simon Fraser University, glanced over and said in an amused voice that the old fellow must have gotten confused about the event. Maybe he was looking for the Heritage Fair. Someone else offered the opinion that even if the bow had been competitive 40 years ago, a man his age would barely be able to draw it back, let alone hold it steady. The jokes were not vicious. They were the jokes of people who were very confident, who had forgotten that confidence and competence are not the same thing. The old man's name was Alistair Dunmore. He was 76 years old. He was a resident of Fort St. John in northeastern British Columbia, and he had driven 4 hours south to Pemberton in a 2001 Dodge Dakota with 340,000 kilometers on the odometer and a small Canadian flag on the antenna that had been there so long it had faded to a pale salmon pink. He wore a plaid wool shirt, canvas work pants, and rubber-soled boots that were clean but clearly not purpose-made for any sport. He had a white moustache and the hands of someone who had worked outdoors for most of his adult life, wide across the knuckles, scarred in 2 or 3 places, and steady in a way that had nothing to do with youth. He heard the comments. He didn't react. He tucked a dozen arrows into the ground quiver at his station and adjusted his arm guard, leather, hand-stitched, shaped with wear to the exact contour of his forearm, and then he stood quietly, feet shoulder-width apart, and waited for the head judge to call the first end. Before anyone on that range understood what they were about to see, here is what you need to know. If you believe that the men and women who served this country deserve to be treated with respect, not for what they wore, not for what they carried, but for what they endured, type the word steady in the comments right now. Type it for all of them. Type it for Alistair Dunmore, who had earned that word a long time before he walked into that gymnasium in Pemberton. Alistair Dunmore was born in 1949 in Dawson Creek, British Columbia. He was the 4th of 6 children in a family that grew most of its own food and heated its home with a wood stove until he was 12 years old. He learned to shoot a bow at the age of 9 from his maternal grandfather, a matey man named Raimi, who had made his own bows from ash saplings and who could put an arrow through a playing card at 30 meters without appearing to aim at all. Young Alistair had the same instinct for it. Not the technical understanding, not yet, but the feel. The understanding, difficult to put into words, of where the arrow was going to go before it left the string. Some people have that. Most people don't, and no amount of practice will give it to you if you weren't born with the seed of it. He enlisted in the Canadian Forces in 1968 when he was 19 years old and was posted to the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. He completed jump school. He completed the Winter Warfare course at Canadian Forces Station Alert, which sits at 82 degrees north latitude and where the wind during training exercises had frozen the moisture in his eyelashes shut. He was deployed twice, once to Cyprus in 1974 during the period of the Turkish intervention, where his unit maintained a buffer zone between communities that were trying to kill each other and where patience and steadiness under pressure were not theoretical qualities but biological requirements. And once, years later, to Bosnia in 1994 as part of the UN Protection Force, where a Canadian rifle company was expected to maintain its composure while being shot at by people who had correctly calculated that a UN mandate prevented the Canadians from shooting back first. He came home from Bosnia with a compression fracture in his left shoulder, a hearing loss in his right ear, and a mention in dispatches that the Canadian forces had awarded quietly and that he had accepted just as quietly and then placed in a shoebox on the top shelf of his bedroom closet in Fort St. John, where it had remained, as far as anyone knew, ever since. The recurve bow he carried to Pemberton was the same bow he had carried since 1971. He had built it himself, under the guidance of a retired bowyer in Edmonton, who had taught him the basics over 2 weekends, and then told him he didn't need to come back because there was nothing left to teach. The ash had come from a windfall on his family's property near Dawson Creek. The rabbit fur rest had been replaced 3 times, the string had been replaced a dozen, but the bow itself, the limbs, the riser, the name burned into the lower limb, that was original, 53 years old, and still in tune. He had shot in competition before. Not often. He disliked crowds and disliked the particular social atmosphere of competitive events, the posturing, the gear talk, the performance of seriousness. But once every few years, something pulled him out. The Pemberton Championship was sanctioned by Archery Canada. It drew serious competitors from across British Columbia and Alberta, and something about the drive, the 2-lane highway through the Duffy Lake corridor in the early morning, the light on the mountains, had put him in the mood for it. He had not told anyone he was coming. The first end was 12 arrows at 18 meters, shot in 2 groups of 6. The format was standard indoor recurve, and the scoring rings on the yellow and black face were familiar to everyone in the building. In an event like this, a top competitor expected to drop no more than 3 or 4 points across an entire round of 60 arrows. The margins were very small, and the equipment at this level was engineered to make those margins smaller. Alistair Dunmore stepped to the line when his group was called. He stood with the bow in his left hand and an arrow on the string and his right hand at his jaw, and he stood that way for a moment without moving. Not hesitating, not steadying his nerves, just looking at the target the way a man looks at something he is about to do, methodically from the inside out. He released 6 arrows. 5 were in the 10 ring, 1 was in the 9, just off centre, and the breath he exhaled after it told a careful observer that he knew exactly what had happened before he walked forward to score. The range officer marked his score without expression, but his eyes held on the group for a second longer than necessary. 5 10s and a 9 from a plain wooden recurve bow with iron sights, which is to say, no sights at all, shot by a man past the age that most people consider peak physical condition, was not something you saw every day. The young man with the hex key, whose name was Scott Prentice, shot the same end at 58 points out of a possible 60, and was quietly pleased with himself until he walked to the target beside Alistair Dunmore's and did the arithmetic. They had shot the same score. Scott Prentice said nothing, but he watched the second end more carefully. The second group of 6, Alistair Dunmore put all 6 in the 10 ring. The sound they made, a dry, clean thud, one after another, spaced about 4 seconds apart, was a particular sound, the sound of someone who knows what they're doing and has known for a very long time. The young woman ranked 3rd in British Columbia. Her name was Jade Weatherford, turned from her own lane and watched the last 2 arrows. She pulled out her phone, considered filming, and then put it back. It felt, somehow, like it would have been rude. By the end of the first distance, Alistair Dunmore was leading the open division by 4 points. The gymnasium had become very quiet. The second distance was 25 metres. At 25 metres, the variables multiply. The arc of the arrow is more pronounced. The timing of the release matters more. And on an instinctive recurve without sights, the shooter is relying entirely on a calculation that takes place below the level of conscious thought. A kind of physical memory so deeply encoded that it operates the way breathing operates. You don't think about it. You just do it, or you've lost it. Alistair Dunmore had not lost it. He moved through the second distance with the same unhurried quality he had brought to the first. Between ends, he stood with the bow resting across his left arm and his right hand in his pants pocket, watching the other competitors with a mild, interested expression. When the range officer called his group to the line, he stepped forward and shot, clean, deliberate, without ceremony. At 25 metres, he dropped 2 points across the entire second distance. 2 points on a plain wooden recurve bow, shot by a 76-year-old man with arthritic knuckles and a left shoulder that had been surgically repaired twice. The head judge, a woman in her 50s named Sandra Poliquin, who had been officiating Archery Canada events for 20 years, walked to the scoring table during the transition and looked at Dunmore's scorecard for a long time. She had seen a great many things in 2 decades of judging. She had seen prodigies who burned out at 23. She had seen comeback stories and equipment failures, and shooters who found something on a given day that they couldn't explain and couldn't replicate. She had not seen this. The third distance was 30 metres. By now, the other competitors had stopped pretending not to watch. Scott Prentice had entirely abandoned the pre-shot routine he had spent 3 years building. Jade Weatherford, who was behind Alistair Dunmore's position in the standings, had told her coach during the distance break that she didn't know what she was looking at. And her coach, a man who had coached at the national level, had told her, very quietly, that neither did he. The comments from earlier in the morning had stopped. Not because anyone had said anything. They had simply run out of air. The kind of thing you say when you're confident and comfortable does not survive contact with evidence to the contrary. And the evidence here was very precise, measured in millimetres on a paper target at the far end of a well-lit gymnasium. And it was not ambiguous. Near the end of the third distance, a man appeared at the side entrance of the gymnasium. He was perhaps 60 years old, stocky, wearing a dark fleece vest and carrying a coffee he hadn't touched. His name was René Martel. He was a retired sergeant major with the Royal Canadian Regiment, now living in Squamish, and he had come to watch a nephew compete. His nephew was a fine young archer. René Martel had been watching him from the bleachers for most of the morning, but when he came through the side door and scanned the gymnasium, he stopped. He stood very still, the way a man stops when he sees something he recognizes at a distance. Not the fact of it, not the name of it, but the shape of it, the way a person moves, the angle of the shoulder. The stillness before the release. René Martel had seen that stillness before. A long time ago in a completely different context, under conditions that had nothing to do with sport. He moved through the bleachers slowly, working his way down toward the preparation area, his eyes on the man with the wooden bow the whole time. He had served in Cyprus in 1974, not in the same rotation as every man who had been there. The Canadian forces had cycled units through regularly, but late enough that the stories of the earlier rotation were still being told. In the mess, in the debrief rooms, in the particular way that soldiers talk about other soldiers who did something that mattered. There had been a night in August of 1974 when a 2-man patrol from the PPCLI had held a buffer position for 11 hours against sustained pressure from a militia unit that had decided the UN's presence was a negotiable obstacle. One of those 2 men had been shot in the upper arm in the 3rd hour and had continued to hold the position until his partner had been able to bring up reinforcements at first light. The other man had not been injured. He had fired 61 rounds that night in the dark, and every one of them had gone where it was intended to go. Nobody who was told that story forgot it, and the way it was told, the detail always repeated, was that the man with the steady hands had made it look, in the telling, as though it had not been particularly difficult, as though it had simply been what needed to happen. The man's name, in every version of that story René Martel had ever heard, was Dunmore. He reached the edge of the preparation area just as the final distance was being called. He stood at the rail and watched Alistair Dunmore step to the line for the last time. And then he watched something he had no frame of reference for, which was this. A man who had been 19 years old in the dark on a dirt road outside Nicosia, holding ground with 61 rounds and a steady pair of hands, now standing in a gymnasium in British Columbia at the age of 76, holding a wooden bow he had made himself and putting 12 arrows into the 10 ring at 30 meters. Clean everyone. The gymnasium was completely silent when the last arrow struck, not the silence of an empty room, the silence of a full room where nobody has anything to say. Jade Weatherford lowered her bow. Scott Prentice stood with his arms at his sides. The head judge, Sandra Polikin, held her clipboard against her chest and looked at the target, and then at the scorer beside her, and then back at the target. René Martel opened the gate at the rail and walked onto the competition floor. He crossed the gymnasium at a measured pace, not running, not hurrying, and when he reached Alistair Dunmore, he stopped about 2 meters away. Alistair had his back half turned, drawing the arrows from the target, and when he became aware of the man standing there, he turned and looked. René Martel said very quietly, "Are you Dunmore? The PP, Cyprus, 74? Alistair looked at him for a moment. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not surprise, exactly, but the recognition that the world had become, in this moment, smaller than it usually was. He said, "2nd Battalion." René Martel nodded once. Then he came to attention, not a formal parade ground snap, but the honest, instinctive straightening of a man who has spent decades doing it and cannot help himself in certain moments, and he said, "Sergeant Major René Martel, Royal Canadian Regiment, retired." He paused. "I heard that story a long time ago. I never thought I'd be able to tell the man it was about." Alistair held the arrows in his left hand and the bow in his right, and he looked at René Martel with an expression that was very difficult to read. Then he gave a small, slow nod. The kind of nod that does not mean you're welcome and does not mean it was nothing. It means something closer to "I know you understand," and that's enough. René Martel turned to face the gymnasium. He didn't raise his voice dramatically, but he didn't need to. The room was already listening. He said, "I want to say something to everyone here if you'll give me a minute." Nobody objected. Nobody moved. He spoke for about 4 minutes. He told them about Cyprus in 1974. Not the history, not the politics, which most of them knew in broad strokes, but the texture of it. The buffer zone, 180 kilometers of it, run by Canadian soldiers who were expected to stand between two heavily armed factions and maintain a peace that neither faction had formally agreed to. The heat, the dust, the particular feeling, he said, of being in a place where the rules said you could not escalate. And the other side knew that, and used it. He told them about the night in August, without dramatizing it, in the plain language of someone who was explaining a thing he had only ever heard secondhand, but had spent decades respecting. He told them that the man standing there with the wooden bow had held a position alone in the dark, with a wounded partner, for most of a night, and had never talked about it afterward. That the mention in dispatches had been put in a shoebox. That the story had survived only because other soldiers told it, the way soldiers do, which is quietly and without flourish. In the margins of other conversations, he told them that the bow the man was holding was the same age as some of the things he had done with those hands. He told them that the laughter from earlier that morning, which he had not heard himself, but which he could infer from the look on certain faces, was the kind of mistake that was very easy to make and very important to unmake. Jade Weatherford, who was 27 years old and had been shooting since she was 10, found that she had no particular thoughts. She had just the feeling of understanding something she had not understood before, which is different from a thought and which takes longer to process. Scott Prentice, the young man with the hex key and the well-calibrated compound bow and the third axis level, stood with both hands at his sides and his expensive equipment on the rack behind him. And he looked at Alistair Dunmore and tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had assumed when the morning started, and found that he simply could not. The assumption had been wrong, and there was nothing complicated about how wrong it had been. He was the first one to walk forward. He stopped in front of Alistair Dunmore and he said, with the particular difficulty of someone who is being honest in public, "I made a comment this morning. About the Heritage Fair. I want to tell you that was stupid, and I'm sorry." Alistair Dunmore looked at him for a long moment. His expression was not unkind. It was the expression of a man who has seen a great many versions of this moment. The moment when a person realizes something true that they should have known sooner, and who understands that the realizing is what matters, not the timing. He said, "You had no reason to know. Don't carry it." Scott Prentice put out his hand. Alistair shook it. Scott's eyes were wet and he didn't look away. One by one, the others came forward. Jade Weatherford, who said nothing but whose handshake lasted longer than a handshake usually does. The coach from Simon Fraser University, who introduced himself formally. A teenage boy competing in the junior category who had been silent all morning and who seemed standing there to be trying to memorize the moment the way you memorize something you know you'll want later. Sandra Poliquin, the head judge, who shook Alistair's hand and then stood beside Renee Martel and said, very quietly, that she didn't have words for it, and Renee Martel said that was probably appropriate. The competition continued. Alistair Dunmore insisted on it in the same mild, firm way that seemed to be the register in which he said everything, not commanding, not negotiating, simply clear. He had come to shoot a match, and the match should be shot. They shot the match. He won the open division by 11 points. He did not miss the 10 ring in the final distance. His total score, shot on a plain wooden recurve bow, with no sights and no mechanical aids, with arthritic knuckles and a surgically repaired shoulder at the age of 76, was the highest raw score posted in the open division in the 5-year history of the Pemberton Regional Championship. When the results were posted and the trophies were brought out, small wooden plaques with brass plates, the kind that sit on a shelf and mean something only to the person who earned them. Sandra Poliquin handed Alistair Dunmore the first place plaque with both hands, which was not the usual way, but which seemed correct. He accepted it with a nod. He did not give a speech. He said only one thing before he walked back to the preparation area to pack the bow into its canvas sleeve. He said it quietly, to no one in particular and to everyone. This bow was made from a tree that fell on my grandfather's land. My grandfather taught me how to use it. I don't shoot for myself. I shoot to show that what he gave me still holds. He slipped the bow into the canvas sleeve with both hands. He rolled the sleeve closed, tucked the arrows into their tube, picked up the ground quiver and walked toward the parking lot exit. Renee Martel stood at the side of the gymnasium and watched him go. Scott Prentice stood beside him without knowing how he had gotten there, and Jade Weatherford on the other side, and the coach from Simon Fraser, who was also not sure how he'd ended up at the railing. None of them spoke for a while. Outside, through the high gymnasium windows, the Pemberton Valley was clear and cold, the mountains white above the tree line, the kind of morning that makes the province feel very large and very old. Alistair Dunmore's truck was in the far corner of the lot, the pale flag on the antenna turning very slowly in a wind nobody inside had felt. 3 months later, Archery Canada's BC Regional Newsletter ran a short note announcing that the Pemberton Regional Championship would henceforth present an annual award called the Dunmore Standard, given to the competitor who demonstrated not the highest score but, and this was Sandra Poliquin's wording, arrived at after a great deal of thought. The deepest continuity between what they carry and what they know. Alistair Dunmore does not have a social media presence. He is not on any platform. He drives back to Fort St. John in the spring and spends the summer months walking the back roads of the Peace River country with the bow over his shoulder, shooting at marks on stumps and fence posts, and the particular quality of light on a given morning, the way his grandfather taught him. He does not announce his presence at competitions. He does not seek recognition. Recognition, in his experience, finds the people it's looking for on its own schedule. Scott Prentice drove up to Dawson Creek in October. He didn't tell anyone he was going. He had found, through Archery Canada's member registry, a phone number, and he had called and asked whether it would be acceptable to come up and spend an afternoon. And the voice on the other end of the phone had said, after a pause, "Bring warm clothes. We'll shoot outside." He came back from that weekend a different archer. He says this to anyone who asks, with a precision that is not dramatic. Different. Not better in any technical sense, not yet, but different in some foundational way that has to do with understanding why the arrow goes where it goes, and what it means to have been doing something long enough that the knowledge lives in the body rather than the mind. He says it changed what he was trying to do. Renee Martel put the story in a letter to the secretary of his regimental association. He didn't send it to anyone else. He thought the regimental association was enough. The letter began with the sentence, "I want to tell you about a man you have never met, who did something 50 years ago that is still doing its work." That sentence is true. The work that a steady hand does not expire at the end of the engagement it carries. It passes through other hands and other years and other mornings in gymnasiums, in valleys surrounded by mountains, and it shows up without warning in the form of a wooden bow and a man who has had the grace to keep faith with what was given to him. Some things get better with age, some things get quieter, and some things in the right pair of hands simply hold, year after year, decade after decade, across every kind of weather, until the day comes when someone finally gets close enough to see what they're really looking at.